Well, it's good to be with you again today. Let's go ahead and get organized for our lesson. For materials today, you're going to need activities 2-1 and 2-3. Now 2-1 is actually going to be a part of your assignment, so you can set that aside, and then 2-3 we're going to be filling in during the lesson, so you can keep that on hand. And today we are going to start with a little review. That's not first on our agenda. And then we're going to be listening to America the Beautiful. We'll be talking about major landforms, and we're going to be working on some activities together. And then hopefully if we have time we'll close with the hymn Higher Ground. So that gives you an idea of what we're covering today. Our main idea for this lesson is that every continent includes the major landforms of mountains, plains, and plateaus. Your goals are to differentiate the three basic landforms, which are mountains, plains, and plateaus, identify one advantage and one disadvantage of each type of landform. Okay, so that's what we have on our horizon today. Let's go ahead and start class today with our chapter verse. Go ahead and read with me 2 Peter 3:5-7. For this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. But the heavens and the earth, which are now by the same word, are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. All right, I hope you've been working on that a little bit on your own, because that's rather lengthy. But if you think about our three time periods, that can help you in recalling those verses. All right, we're going to start out with a review today, and you need to see if you can label the parts of the earth. Okay? What would this be? Pointing to a section of land, right? So that would be the lithosphere. Okay, here we have a section of water, which will be the hydrosphere. This section isn't actually touching the earth, this arrow isn't, so that would be our atmosphere. Okay, then let's go to the inner, or the cross section of the earth. It's on the very outer surface, the crust. Okay, then we have the mantle. And this is going to be two sections, so what would this part be? It's going to be the outer core, right? And that makes this answer pretty easy, doesn't it? The inner core. Okay, just a little review on the sections of the earth. All right, and you also should have filled in some of your tiny tables for your assignment last night. So let's take a quick look at the information and make sure that you got it correct. On activity 2-3, you were to do the divisions of the earth, which we just looked at: atmosphere, lithosphere, and hydrosphere. The atmosphere is a covering of air surrounding the earth. This doesn't have to be word for word. The lithosphere, solid part of the earth, and the hydrosphere, water on the earth's surface. And it could be, Mom and Dad have already checked over this. And these over here were so easy, all you had to do is copy them right down. The oceans by size: Pacific is the largest, Atlantic, Indian, and Arctic. You might have also done it in the opposite order, started with the smallest and then gone to the largest. Continents by size, starting with the largest: Asia, Africa, North America, South America, Antarctica, Europe, and Australia. Also, you'll be filling in the major types of landforms section today, which you'll find right there at the bottom. And you'll need a description, the advantage for man and the disadvantage for man. That's one of your goals. Find one for each, one advantage and disadvantage for each landform, as well as describing it. Okay, so we're going to start out today by listening to America the Beautiful. And I want you to jot down any words that you think have to do with landforms. right. What words did you write? Well, if you're paying attention during the goals for today, you should have recognized at least 2 of the 3 basic landforms mentioned. Mountains in Purple Mountain Majesties and plains in the phrase above the fruited plain. All right, so on our activity, you know so far we have mountains, right? And plains. All right, but what exactly do we mean by the term landform? If you think of a mountain and a plain, what definition could you come up with that would include both of those and describe a landform? Well, by landform we simply mean every slight variation in the landscape. Okay, and as noted in our goals, there are 3 major landforms that we're going to deal with today, and those are mountains, plains, and plateaus. So you can go ahead and get plateaus written there on your list. And we want to start out with mountains. You're probably thinking, okay, I already know what a mountain is. What's the big deal? But let's look at some geographical definitions of these terms. Mountains can be defined as landforms rising above the surrounding landscape. And some terms associated are mountain range, and that is the formation of many mountains together. And this is an interesting point concerning the definition of mountains. Local usage determines which of those landforms are hills and which are mountains. Now, hills are smaller versions of mountains, but the division between hills and mountains isn't always clear. For instance, the Black Hills of South Dakota, which you've probably heard of, are actually higher than the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. So it just depends on the landscape of the area. Hills aren't actually listed as a separate landform in your textbook because they can appear almost anywhere in connection with other types of landforms, mountain ranges, plains, plateaus, and so on. So we don't deal with them separately. And even though the division between hills and mountains is basically arbitrary, it is possible to make generalizations. Okay, so if we have hills, they typically have a local relief or a rise above the base of less than 2,000 feet. So that's the general area of a hill. Okay, so from the base, whatever the local relief is, up is going to be about 2,000 feet. That's going to fit in the category of hills. And mountains then are going to be above that, right? That's pretty obvious. So above 2,000 feet is going to be referred to as a mountain in general. Local people living in flatland tend to describe any high points as mountains, whereas people living near the mountains tend to call those lesser rises hills. Okay, so that kind of gives you a little history on the difference between hills and mountains. Now, even measuring the height of mountains can be confusing, because remember our definition? Okay, a mountain is the visible rise above the surrounding terrain. It's not the elevation above sea level. And here's a good example. Mount Elbert, this is Mount Elbert in the Rocky Mountains, and it's at 14,433 feet above sea level. It's the highest peak in the Rocky Mountains, but when you're looking at it, see it in this picture, it doesn't look that tall. That's because the valley it rises from is about 10,000 feet above sea level. So looking up from the valley, you see a rise of only 4,433 feet. So it doesn't look very tall at all. Mount Rainier, on the other hand, is 14,410 feet. That's a little lower than Mount Elbert. It looks like about 3 times as high because you can actually see it from the coast. Okay, so that's why it can be a little, confusing when you're trying to measure a mountain, which is the highest mountain. Well, Mount Elbert doesn't look higher than Mount Rainier, but it is because of its elevation above sea level. All right. Now, summit and peak are also some terms that are sometimes confusing when we're referring to mountains. And sometimes those two terms are used interchangeably. But now that we're getting into 9th grade, we're going to be a little more precise. A summit is actually the high point on a mountain. Okay, so it's going to be the high point of that mountain. But a peak refers to any significant rise near the top of the mountain. All right, so there can be a lot of peaks, but the highest one is going to be a summit. All right, and on this picture you can see an example of that. You can see several peaks, looks like about 4 peaks, but the highest one there to the right of center is going to be the summit. That's the actual highest point of this mountain. And sometimes mountain climbers will climb up, and especially if they're amateurs, they'll climb up a peak and be like, wow, we reached the summit, when they really haven't. They've just reached the top of a lesser peak. Okay? Now, each type of landform has advantages and disadvantages for the people living there. And this is something that you're going to want to put into your chart. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of living in the mountains. And I grew up in mountains, so I'm pretty familiar with this. Okay, some pros or advantages. Mines, there's a lot of mining done in Kentucky, which was my home state, coal mining in particular. Protection, and that's not as important in modern times as it would have been when people were first looking for a place to locate when civilizations were beginning in our country. But it is an important feature of mountains. And then the cons. First of all, they're cold, especially the higher you get, the colder it's going to be. The soil in general is poor in the mountains, and mountains can also hinder travel and communication. Now, some of that is changing today. I know there was a lot of farming where I grew up, so it just depends, but especially the higher you go up, the less profit farmers are going to get from the soil. And concerning travel and communication, it's really funny. We used to go to my grandparents all the time when I was young. It took like 3 hours, and it was just this windy, make you sick road. And now they've just knocked everything out, and there's this big 2-lane going through there. So it's going to be a little easier. Certain places, though, is always going to be difficult to get to. So travel has improved somewhat over the years, especially, from the rutted roads that they would have started with. And then, of course, communication. And this would go back a little ways as well, when people had to take a message to someone. And nowadays, of course, people just plug in their computer, send a little email, and can communicate easily. But those in general are some pros and cons of living in the mountains. Now, mountains are very important because they do influence the weather, the climate, the vegetation, and also human settlements. And those are some important ideas to associate with mountains. Now, second type of landform that we want to look at today is the plain. Now, plains can be defined as wide areas of level land. That's probably what most people think of when they think of plains. But plains can be at high or low elevations. They don't have to be one or the other. And also, there may be some hills in the plains as well, so they don't have to be totally flat. Here's an example of plains, but you can also see some rolling hills there in the background with those plains. Okay, so it might be a little bit different than what you always think of when you think of plains, unless you've, of course, grown up near plains. There are 2 general types of plains, coastal and alluvial plains. Coastal plains is pretty self-explanatory. Those are going to be plains near a coast. And alluvial plains might need a little more explanation. Alluvium is actually mineral-rich sediment, and it's deposited from rivers. And so alluvial plains are often named after the rivers that flow through them. Okay? Plains areas are also sometimes referred to as breadbaskets. Do you know why? Think of what would often be grown on a plain. Often it's going to be grain, isn't it? And the plains generally produce the grain that we need to make bread, which is a staple food in probably every area of the world. But plains, like mountains, also have their pros and cons. All right, pros of living on a plain. The most evident is going to be the rich soil. They do have the ability to grow all the different types of grain and a lot of vegetation. Also, because they are generally flat, it's going to be very easy to travel and communicate if you live on a plain. cons of living on a plain, they are often flooded by the rivers that flow through them, and they're generally unprotected from invasion. And again, that would have more to do with the history behind the plain, you know, what nation settled there, what group of people settled there, than it really has to do with us today. But it is something important to keep in mind. It does affect the civilizations and the settlements that are in the plains areas. Okay, that brings us to plateaus, our third landform, and a plateau can be defined as, again in plural, wide areas of relatively flat land rising abruptly from surroundings. And notice the key, an important word there, italicized, relatively flat. All right, so they don't have to be totally flat. They can include steep cliffs or slopes, especially, you know, one side is going to have some kind of cliffs or slope because it has to rise abruptly from the surrounding land. Plateaus are also known as tablelands or highlands, and highlands actually refers to the most rugged of the plateaus, so they're going to be rougher than the tablelands. Okay? Also, another interesting fact about plateaus is that they can occur at almost any elevation. We might generally think of them as being really high, like the term highlands, but they can occur at about any elevation. Now, plateaus are actually much more varied than plains. Plains also included some rolling hills, but plateaus can include hills also. There might be mountains nearby and canyons as well. A great example, which you've probably seen before, if not in person, at least in pictures, is the Grand Canyon. It actually cuts through a large plateau. Right? So they can be quite varied in their relief. Now, as you can see from that photo, plateaus have their advantages and disadvantages as well. Pros of living in a plateau. They generally have a lot of grass for livestock, and although the Grand Canyon looks pretty rough, generally plateaus, because they are going to be flat, are easy to travel. Relatively flat, remember. So relatively easy to travel. Then cons are poor soil and also very few natural resources located on the plateaus. And just keep in mind that these things that we're going through, these little lists that I'm giving you, these are generalizations. Like I said, with the mountains, generally poor soil, yet my grandfather was a farmer, so there are crops that are grown there. So just remember, this is a general to help you, especially with the areas in which you haven't lived. If you've lived in the mountains, you're pretty familiar with that, or if you've lived in the plains, you're familiar. But this will give you some general ideas for those other areas. Now, geographers have a tool with which they can display not only these three landforms, but many other geographical terms. So we're going to take a moment to learn about it right now.
Oh, hello there. I've been trying to reach you, but my communication lines seem to be unavailable at the moment. I have something I want to show you. This is a diagram. A diagram is something you use to graphically explain something that would be otherwise hard to visualize. Pardon me, but all this talking loudly has made me a bit raspy. Wolfgang, you are a genius. Why did I not think of that? Oh, anyway, where was I? Oh yes, for example, I can use this to explain the types of geographic areas that I'll be coming in contact with. I would want you as investors to know about the different types of geographical places I'll be seeing. Then when I report back to you, you'll know what I'm referring to when I use these terms. For instance, you may have little or no idea what in the world an estuary is. But with this diagram, I can show you that an estuary is a long, wide river mouth that rises and falls with the tides. And of course, everyone's heard the word sound. But as you can see, sound can also refer to a long, wide stretch of water that acts as a passageway between larger bodies of water or that leads inland from the ocean. The things I'm diagramming and labeling don't necessarily have to be real places or things, but can be just models or representatives. This doesn't depict a real place, but shows you what is needed. In all my research, I have yet to discover a real place on Earth I could use to display all these things in one small diagram. But I'm sure you can see how they'll come in handy and how well I would keep you, as my investors, informed. Now, I wonder who else I might be able to contact with this radio.
All right, now that you understand the nature of the diagram, let's look in your textbook at pages 24 and 25. And we have some questions that we're going to want to answer here in a few minutes. But we can see here are some common geographic terms and several terms here on page 24. And you'll want to read over those, and then they continue on to page 25. 2 columns of geographical terms we'll be using throughout the year. You might want to pause the program now and look at these, or look at them as we go along and answer the questions. And this diagram goes along with the terms as well, so that'll give you a good understanding of what the terms are. Okay, they're actually in the form of clues. Like a peninsula, it is a landform that sticks out of the sea, but it has a distinct point. Okay, and if you're looking at the diagram, you can probably find the answer quicker on the diagram than you can looking through the terms. But you can see here the distinct point on this cape. So cape is the answer. Okay? And our second one, like a valley, land rises above it on all sides, but the sides are close together and steep. All right, and here you can see not as well on the diagram on this one. Okay, there's the canyon, but if you listen to the definition and if you glanced over the terms, you could probably figure that that would be a canyon. All right, like a hill, it has a slope, but the slope is limited to one side. Okay, from your diagram, that one's pretty quick to see. It is an escarpment. Escarpment right here. Okay, number 4. Like a mesa, it is a hill with a flat top, but it is smaller. And that one's pretty easy. Right here's the mesa, a hill with a flat top, and next to it the butte, a smaller hill with a flat top. Number 5, a special category of river mouth. It is made of sediment in the shape of a fan. This is one you've probably heard about for years, and that is the delta. You can see how the river fans out here at the delta. Number 6, a special category of river mouth. It is subject to tidal changes. Okay, that's one you would probably have to look up or have read about. That is the estuary that our geographer was just recently talking about. It's a special type of river mouth, but it is subject to tidal changes. Number 7, like a reef, it is a ridge near the shore that rises up from the ocean floor, but it rises above the surface. Okay, and this one is depicted right here. It does look similar to the reef, but it is above water, and that is a bar. Number 8, like a strait, it is a water passageway between bodies of water, but it is wider. Okay, and this is also one we just heard about. Here is the strait, the little passageway that's narrow, and here's a sound. It's a wider passageway between the bodies of water. And then number 9, like a bay, It is a body of water open to the sea, but it is usually larger and its opening is narrow. Okay, this is not as easy to spot on our diagram here. Here's our bay. It's actually a gulf. This one doesn't have a narrow opening, but it is a body of water open to the sea, and it's larger than our bay. All right, now that wraps up our lesson. We're going to close by listening to Higher Ground and see what geographical allusions you can recognize.
I'm pressing on the upward way, new heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I'm onward bound. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand, having on heaven's table stand, a higher plane than I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground.
All right, what phrases did you come up with from this verse of the song? Upward way gives us an idea of climbing up. He talks about new heights, so that gives us an idea of maybe a mountain or a plateau. Also, he does mention planting my feet on higher ground, the title of the song, Lord, lift me up. Then he particularly mentions heaven's tableland, so we think of the plateau there, tableland or highland. He does talk about a higher plane, but it's a geometrical plane, like geometry, plane like this, instead of the geographical plane that we were talking about today. And again, he ends with, Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. All right, now that ends our lesson today, and let's go ahead and take a moment to look at our assignment. You need to read pages 22 through 25, what we've talked about today. Complete the section review, which is on page 26, so don't forget to flip over and do that review. And activity 2-1, number 5. You want to work on that number today, and that will be filling in the mountain ranges, plateaus, and plains. Okay? As you read, see if you can think of the answer to this question. Which landform would you prefer to live on or near, and why? Where in the world did you find the answer to our question? Where can you find the world's smallest mammal? Thailand, the Kitty's hog-nosed bat. And for next time, where is the longest coral reef?